In today's episode of Field Frequency, we dive into XCharge's infrastructure first approach to DC fast charging. In this episode, I sit down with Atish Patel, co founder and COO, to unpack how he went from being an XCharge customer to building its North American arm. We explore how XCharge cuts through the noise in a commoditized market by streamlining deployment, simplifying serviceability, and building a charging platform that actually pencils out for the operators. Let's get into it. Welcome to another episode of Field Frequency. Today I'm joined by Atish Patel of XCharge. Atish, thanks for being on Field Frequency. Look forward to speaking to you today. Glad we were able to set this up. Before we get started, I'd like you to just introduce yourself to the audience, talk about what led up to your role as Chief Operations Officer and co-founder of XCharge, talk about your history, whatever led to the seat that you're sitting in today. Walk us through that. And again, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
No, appreciate Jason and appreciate you for kind of setting this up and having me on here. I'm just getting into it. I'm Atish Patel, COO of XCharge Group and head of North America for XCharge, I guess, as a whole. I've been at the company for about 5 years now, and I was actually the guy who started off the North American org for the company, XCharge, I guess, NA. But what actually how it transpired and all that's actually a pretty good story in the sense that I was actually a customer of XCharge before I, um, got into the seat and ultimately landed to where I am here. The origin story really is, I've been in the product development space for a number of years, working in supply chain, product development and whatnot in the additive manufacturing space. And I also have a family connection to real estate and real estate development and asset management. It was 2018, 2019, was looking to find ways to help monetize, help our properties monetize a little bit more. And, Tesla had this super sweet destination charging program that they kind of rolled out with the Model S's that kind of rolled out in the mid 2010s. And, we had a couple of these chargers installed at our properties, and I kind of noticed that people were using these more and more around that time, especially as like Tesla started to roll out the Model 3 and all that fun stuff was coming in. So, the idea kind of clicked in my head, like there's a way to make money off of this. And in the future, when there's more electric vehicles, there's going to be a need for chargers. And frankly speaking, nothing should be, free as a service. I think there has to be a way to do money based charging, and we were starting to see it with the rollout of Electrify America and the supercharger programs and whatnot. So I wanted to get in on that, and I wanted to figure out a way to do it with the properties that we had. So, and I could go on for this for a bit, but I'll try and digress a little bit, make it a little condensed. I went and tried to find a solution that made sense for the properties that we had, hotels and I guess commercial properties of that nature. Talked with a lot of big names in the space back then, as well as a lot of other smaller names in this space, and nothing made sense. And the reason it didn't make sense mainly was the compatibility with the infrastructure we found here in the States, and then from an operations standpoint, the method in which the entire solution was kind of put together and how, me as an operator would need to intertwine to get it to work and ultimately monetize. It cost a ton to install, mainly because, 480 what was often the native input for the equipment, but for sites, it was often 208. And then even when you got the thing installed, you needed separate software to manage it. You needed separate payment systems to accept credit card, and integrations and all that were still kind of quite, infant back in the day. So, and it all cost a ton of money to the point where it didn't even make sense from an ROI standpoint to operate a unit. So the root of the issue, that I kind of identified was infrastructure was the big driver. And that was something that really kind of struck a chord with me, mainly because I didn't really see a reason why people weren't accommodating, I guess, the 208 voltage here and kind of looking at it from an infrastructure first approach. I talked with basically every charging company under the sun in the US and China and India and Italy and Europe and Korea. Just by way of my sourcing background, I knew the channels to tap, and I did an exercise of sourcing and got laughed at a lot when I brought up 208 volt because no one seemed to believe that 208 three-phase was a thing outside of those in the US. And Those in the US didn't know how they could make it because they weren't the ones actually making the product. So the long story short of it is I connected with XCharge. We were able to come to an agreement to basically co-develop a product for North America off of 208, in which, I did a lot of the brunt work on the engineering side of, you know, getting the product spec, finding suppliers for some of the core components, actually working with those suppliers to develop these components, and then, work with XCharge to make the entire assembly, which is the charger. And that's the C6 we still sell today. Went through that process, took about a year and a half and a decent amount of money to get it done, but was able to do so. And, in that time, we had a charger that was delivered that fell off a truck. And, a bunch of probably 3 or 4 months of on-site troubleshooting that had to occur, which, was a very fun experience and honestly very valuable because I learned early on what it takes to get this equipment up and running from a servicing standpoint. And, we got a product, we got it certified. It was doing everything that we kind of put together on the white paper that I had originally written for the company back then. And, with that, was able to come to agreement with, the XCharge leadership, Simon, at that time, to basically, instead of act as a customer, attack the market together. And, that's where I co-founded North America for XCharge and led that for a few years. And then ultimately that transpired into us kind of doing XCharge Group, going through the formal IPO process and doing all that fun stuff, but then also playing a part in not only the North American trajectory for the company, but a broader part in the global aspect, just because of my background with products and operations and whatnot. So that's the abridged shorthand version of how we kind of got there, but it's a little bit of it's definitely a good beer story.
Yeah, and you said a lot, and if we were to take sections and unpack, there was a lot of there was some details that stood out to me because one of the things was that you saw existing infrastructure in place and not considered as the resource to focus on to deploy charging. So that's, tucked in that if we were to unpack that is a part of that origin story of XCharge because that's going to lead into the product messaging, what the design looked like. And so interesting point that you also made is that you were customer first. It's a shared experience actually. Of course, I lead the e-mobility at Field Advantage, a field service provider. I was a customer of theirs before whenever I was working for a manufacturer, a heating manufacturer of yours. Anyway, so it's interesting to hear kind of the origin story and what led up, the abridged version. And there's a lot, you mentioned the unit falling off the truck. I'm assuming that's probably like a beta unit or an early test unit. I'm sure we could probably talk a little bit about what that was. But just kind of narrowing in because I think there is a very key part to all of this, and that is found in the design of XCharge, in the design of the product that you brought to market, and some differentiating factors and points and features about that product that ties into the gaps that you saw through your discovery process, through that journey that you laid out for us. At the beginning, you talked about these suppliers, global suppliers, looking at things through that kind of zooming out and not looking at being myopic about a product, but looking at infrastructure and how do we leverage that? And so getting to the point here, on my side, the EV charger market is crowded. It's noisy. Chargers are becoming commoditized become commoditized in a sense that you have, excuse me, I got this notification on my screen. The chargers are, for the most part, become commoditized. And so how has XCharge, and that's as we peel back those layers that you were talking about, how has XCharge carved out a niche product as it compares to other hardware providers in the market?
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong in the sense that it is a crowded space, especially, in the DCFC, I guess, sector, if you want to call it that. Though we are starting to see consolidation. And I think, over the past year or two, there have been some, entities that just aren't around anymore, just by way of natural selection kind of coming into play. What's really kind of kept us growing and what's kind of one of the, things about XCharge products that you really don't see anywhere else is our infrastructure first approach to the product. And by that, I mean, we really design and push our products with the mindset of the infrastructure that they're going to be on, as opposed to necessarily just focusing in solely on the functionality they aim to achieve. And what I mean by that is a charger is only as good as, if it's able to be installed. You can have a 400 or a megawatt, output charger, but if you can't find a place to install it, it's useless. So, what we've really been focusing on, and you see it across our C6 line of products, our GridLink line of products, and even our C7 line of products to a degree, is that they're meant to be installed anywhere you would need charging. Not necessarily anywhere that a charger could go. And what I mean by that is you would need charging, in a commercial shopping center or in a Whole Foods parking lot or a gym or even a fleet depot. But natively, those sites may not have the infrastructure to support, say, like a typical DCFC. And that
Mhm.
could be because of incompatible base voltage that's available on the house panels, or a lack of power and capacity, not only in the building, but also in the feeder that's, leading up to the site itself. So we're in the camp that, hey, our equipment should be easy to install because once it's installed and it's functioning, it's very useful and that provides value to us and ultimately the customer. But also, it shouldn't be a process or too much of a process to get equipment up and running. Where we see a lot of the root of the issue kind of occur is is with the infrastructure that you're going to install on. 208 volt, input is one of those things that we kind of pioneered and pushed out, and we still continue to do and support, with the GridLink being our latest product that kind of supports that. I think the other thing is like, ease of install. All of our units are fully integrated systems. We're not doing, cabinet based systems with separate dispensers, and we're not shipping things separate. Everything's kind of pre assembled for the most part. And, from an installation standpoint, there's a single 3-phase interconnection or termination within the cabinet. There's not any separate low voltage or DC, input output kind of trickery there. It's all quite simple and easy to install. And what we've have gotten constant feedback on from several installers is that our equipment is very straightforward. You don't need, we offer training, and that's one of the resources we do. It's training on site, training remotely, and training materials. But usually when people see the equipment and they see what the hookup is, they question whether they're done, just considering how simple it often is. But, that kind of goes to how we go about making our equipment in the first place. The infrastructure approach. Easy up means, just a better experience for everyone else. And that's not only from an installation standpoint, but then also from an operations and maintenance standpoint. So, it's that holistic approach that we take to charging. And we're not pumping out a ton of products all the time in terms of product lines, but every single product we provide is very flexible. And from an economy standpoint, that also allows us to be quite nimble and quite creative in terms of where we can deploy product and whatnot. I'd say that's
So
kind of our key differentiation.
yeah, that's a big differentiation. Talk about the flexibility of the deployment, installers uncrating, connecting, terminating final connections. Wait, is this it? That's a big deal. So it's not only flexibility, but it's functionality. So talking about using native infrastructure, leveraging that, we're talking about reduction in probably deployment costs from the need for upgraded utility service, the requirement that traditional DCFC needs, the 3-phase, 480 volts, and then of course all the electrical construction related to that, the civil work, et cetera, the tearing up of the ground. I mean, I've been trying to deploy chargers in existing locations for many years. And my target vertical when I first entered this space was the petroleum C-store space. So the retailers of fuel, whether it's single site owner operators or big marketing petroleum retailers and marketers, they build their sites with 1,500 amp panels typically. So infrastructure was a barrier. And so you've talked about the design behind the product and leveraging existing infrastructure to work in relation to the product that you brought to market. So let's narrow in on the operators, your customers, the site owners, and the owner operator of the equipment. A customer experience, obviously, for their customer goes beyond them plugging in their customer as the operator and owner and operator of the hardware that you design and sell to them. So their customer, of course, is plugging in, but for the site operator, it's about utilization to drive the ROI behind the deploying the equipment to begin with, and then of course the uptime. So utilization, uptime. How does XCharge design its product to make owning and operating the product line, whether it's GridLink or the legacy products that you have? What's that look like to the operator?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is written in our company code or employee manual or whatever you call it, is, our focus on ROI.
Mm.
And it's not only, on selling our product and getting a gross margin, but really looking at it holistically for our customer. Because ultimately, the ROI is why a customer would be interested in our product. And if we're able to maximize that ROI for the end customer, there's more opportunity for us to get return on that investment as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be monetary ROI. I guess utilization, reliability, and all that, that is one of those things that does play in a factor into the ROI of an investment, though, many people seem to omit it. So, touching a little bit deeper into that, our products are meant to be very straightforward. And, from the installation, before we even get into installation procurement, we don't muck about when we're talking about pricing or procurement. We provide inclusive pricing. It's delivered to your address, taxes, tariff, freight included. We don't want our customers to have to figure out how to do import, export, logistics, and all that. And that definitely helps make things a lot simpler when it comes to someone trying to get one of these things up and running, especially those who aren't, say, large CPOs. A lot of our customers are first time, small time charge point operators, and they may not know how to ship LTL. They may not know how to do, import of foreign products. They may not know, ordering a lift gate or scheduling a shipment and doing all that. We handle that from the get-go. And that's one of those services that comes with us that I don't think anyone really does outside of ours. The second thing, with us is we have a full team internally to help advise on the installation and solution aspect of it. So we have an internal team that, comes from the EPC and telecoms world that advises on, installation, I guess, installation pathways for products, installation for, permitting and engineering work that may be needed for an installation and stuff like that, as well as, we can provide turnkey services to more or less get a charger installed if they need it without having to go through, a separate vendor, which dramatically simplifies that end of the process. So we can get a charger installed, or we can just sell you a charger. Depending on your flavor, we have the ability to either, to take care of our customer even before the charger's in the ground fully. And once the charger's in the ground, we have an internal after sales team that, is engineering based, and, their job is to make sure the chargers work, the drivers are able to charge. And when things do go around, we work with, partners like you and, others to basically get things resolved in a timely manner. And time is the key. We need to make sure things, are done expeditiously because, again, the ROI matters. And every minute or hour or day that the charger's not online, it's lost money for the customer. And, you got to keep that in mind when, taking on the responsibility of having a customer to make sure that they remain a customer. They need to make sure that they get their money's worth from their product. And that's where, we have a team that its whole job is to just make sure that the products work. And when they don't work, they get back to working as quickly as possible. And, that's partially why we've been able to be so successful is, our commitment to our hands-on approach to the product and to the customer, which, not only allows them to succeed, but ultimately allows them to generate more return on their investments, whether it be from revenue generation or, say, for fleets, just not reliable charging to get their operations in continuous form. But, that's a system we've built out over the years of operations here, as well as through our countless experiences in Europe, dealing with, utilities, some of the largest municipal bus fleets out there, as well as operators, and then taking that experience and really transitioning it here with American flavor, kind of just scaling it as we go. XCharge has about a decade of experience under its belt. Considering, the DCFC space, that's quite a lot, even though it, only is 10 years. Many companies do not have that breadth, and we've done it in all three of the major markets right now. Asia, which started to pop off in 2012, 2013. Europe, which started to pop off in like 2016 onwards. And now the US, in which we entered into the States in around 21, and have been kind of firming up our foundation ever since. So that experience level is irreplaceable. And that's another thing that really kind of adds on to the ROI aspect that we have, not only for ourselves, but the customers that we ultimately serve.
Thank you for that overview and the kind of tying in on the reliability piece of it, because you mentioned taking a step back first and saying it this way. There's been a lot of foresight in the design of the product. There's been a lot of intentionality around the deployment process or the operational flow from basically the beginning of an opportunity and the intake of that customer's needs to the deployment and getting the unit designed according to their spec and then out the door and landing where it's going to be deployed. So there's been a lot of foresight in the design of all that. Obviously, without revealing anything related to your secret sauce, but I want to double click because you talked about an aspect of the foresight around the deployment, around the product, around the design, around the operational flow. You touched on the maintainability. You talked about having third-party field service providers. You referenced us as an example. So without obviously revealing any secret sauce, maybe what's one example of the maintainability of the product? And the reason why I'm asking about that is obviously reliability, uptime is a pain point in this industry. And so what's maybe one example that you could share of the product as it relates to a specific design or maybe an operational choice in the way it was made? Because that no doubt has been infirmed through your discovery process of other manufacturers kind of, pre-XCharge days.
Yeah, I mean, without getting too into it in terms of proprietary tech, I think one of the design philosophies that we take into consideration when, say, the NPI process or the, design and engineering process of a product is the accessibility. And what I mean by that is not only accessibility for like a user to access, but an installer or even a service technician to, say, swap out a cable or reach a board to replace or reach the termination connections when doing the final installation and stuff like that. And, our goal is, and we have guidelines that talk about clearances and whatnot, that our team follows when designing things. Um, you shouldn't have to disassemble half the charger
Mm-hmm.
to, swap a cable or swap a board or, replace a POS, which, are going to be the main wear items for these types of products and are going to be the things that require the most replacement and care. Similar to a car, when you go to an oil change, you're not having to take apart half the engine to get to the oil filter. It's usually in an
Mm-hmm.
accessible spot. And, the same is here where for a cable, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to swap out a cable. And I've done it myself a few times. It's very much, a straightforward process, but it's also, designed in a way where, there's enough clearance and whatnot for a technician to access, but also internally, we're being mindful of airflow, other considerations from an engineering aspect to make sure that a cable doesn't fail from an internal design reason. So like, those are the things that we, definitely take into consideration. And what we have seen, and this is just through field experience of going to sites and having to replace chargers for others, there's variability in how things are designed. And when you hear about the nightmares of swapping a cable or, doing this or doing that, you kind of can reaffirm it when you see equipment when it's opened up and, there. So not going to name names, but I can tell you a lot of stuff is not designed well
Yeah,
from a technician or an accessibility standpoint. And that's where you
absolutely
hear a
not.
lot about, reliability issues. So there's that.
Yeah, it's actually there's in addition to the accessibility, the ease of accessibility, you use the example of a cable. A cable, most OEMs designate a cable as a consumable because of the wear and tear and because of the usage, et cetera. Most OEMs define cables as consumables. And so to your point, you open up a legacy unit. It was not designed with preventative maintenance or even corrective maintenance in mind. It was more you open some of the legacy units up and it's a spider's nest of wires. There's not design and segmentation of boards and relays. Or maybe it is, but it's been so compacted in there you can't necessarily get to it without taking parts, to your point of access to a oil filter on an automobile. It's not it's tucked away somewhere where you can't get to it at all without taking half the thing apart. So that's when you kind of peel back the layers of what that really means to the operator, that means when you do have to address the consumables, when you do have to address the preventative maintenance components, you don't have a technician on site for long periods of time running the meter, running the costs up. It's in and out. It's so that's part of that maintainability secret sauce that you've brought to market. So that's good. You talked about the markets that XCharge is in. Obviously, you've got customers in varied verticals. You've got customers in varied marketplaces. So when you're working with the site owner, the site host, the owner operator of the equipment, you're working with fleets. You mentioned that, but maybe public charging is in the customer mix. I don't know, but clearly there's got to be expectations that differ from the eastern to the western hemisphere, particularly within verticals in those spaces. So how does XCharge adapt its model based on the market it's in, the customer? Is there kind of a boutique design to the product for the customers that you're working with, or do you kind of have an out of the box product? How's that look like? What's that look like?
I mean, we have all of our products are meant for, say, all use cases for charging. However, obviously there's some that are more, akin to others, like public charging versus fleet. That being said, and we tend to have marketing materials and general case studies or, documents or just examples that kind of point towards two main verticals. And it's often just CPO, retail charging business, and then, behind the fence fleet operations. And that's how we have been working through the years. And really, our emphasis has always been fleet first. And that's mainly from a reliability standpoint for our products and the functionality standpoint, because we got started off in Europe and in Asia, really catering to just fleets. And with the fleets, it was heavily focused on, and it's not just the hardware. I think the other thing I want to make a key distinction is XCharge makes the hardware, but then they also make the software and the after sales experience. So it's full solution. So with that in mind, fleet-based charging really has taught us a lot about what's fleets and honestly people who do high volume charging look for in terms of the reliability aspect, experience aspect, and then also from a data aspect, from a reporting standpoint and whatnot. The transition that we made into public charging really is adding a layer on top of the base of the fleet, which, with public, it's just a change in the authorization method and then some of the reporting methods when it comes to the billing cycle. But the fundamentals still stay the same, mainly in the sense of reliable charging experience with, robust support and, uptime commitments and I guess capability through the product, the service, and the software that's there. So, it's like that. With the public charging guys, though, we do a lot more focus on the infrastructure bit, because going back to the whole niche that's kind of made us special is, the ease of infrastructure. And you touched on it early on, infrastructure costs are a significant part of a charging operation. Our products are really oriented towards having manageable infrastructure costs. And, that's one of the areas where we do a lot of highlighting when we're, specifically say going down a revenue-based charging opportunity from a business development standpoint.
Well, that's good. We've talked about XCharge's industry entrance and market strategy. We've talked about kind of the operational design, the differentiating factors, your customer experience, your end customer's experience, and the operational flow. Let's get into the headwinds of this industry. We don't have to look too far to see examples of companies in this space that have struggled, have been acquired, have closed the doors, et cetera. And so as XCharge is an OEM, you no doubt have to navigate the narratives around long-time viability. That's a message that obviously you have to address with all prospective buyers, whether it's the startup buyers, kind of the mid-tier or early CPOs entering the market, or the legacy. So OEMs have to around long-term viability with prospective buyers. That is first and foremost in the mind of the prospective buyer when it comes to chargers, because they don't obviously want to pair up a company that's not going to be around. And we've seen a lot of reasons to have that concern from the CPO perspective. And CPOs are early, or, late to market, new to market, when I say. So how does Charge navigate through those narratives and talk about long-term viability?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a question that comes up a lot these days, actually, for us, especially with, recent events in the space, especially from an OEM level. So, we get a lot of people that ask us like, hey, we're about to, we're considering spending several thousands or millions of dollars of our money on your equipment in the hopes that it lasts, for, 5-10 years or whatever. But how do we know that you're, set up for that? Or how do we know we're not going to be left holding a bag? And, we talk them through, the viability of the company and the history and whatnot, which, Right? We're one of the few DCFC, companies that are actually listed in the market. So that's definitely something that we weren't able to do because we were poorly run or anything. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, we have a process, and our process is meant to be selectively collaborative, with the right people to ensure longer term viability and redundancy. So what do I mean by that is we're using components in our equipment that are readily available for the most part. And, we're not afraid to let people know that it's an ABV part number, or, it's a Amphenol cable or whatnot with this configuration for pins. So, you are allowed to procure on your own, and we do sell parts ourselves, and we do work with distributors to store parts for our equipment for people to purchase and have on spare part supply if they wish. We also provide, a lot of documentation, not only for maintenance, but also for repairs, and the ability to train people, to do a cable swap themselves, to do a fuse replacement, to do a board swap, and all that fun stuff there, so that they're not reliant on necessarily just us to go out and fix it. There are savvy enough operators and, customers of ours who keep a stock of spare parts on their side. And, it's not insignificant in terms of the volume that they keep, to basically ensure that they have access to these parts to fix the equipment themselves, so that they're not, relying on us to send someone out there doing it ourselves. And that really helps with the resilient aspect. And we are proactive in terms of training and providing guidance on how to do this, because at the end of the day, we want the customer to not only choose us because of our product, but choose us because of us. The partnership aspect is a key thing here. And one of the things that we take very heavily, and we've seen in the industry in terms of the good and the bad, is that partnerships are what make or break your company or your success. So, we work to have very strong partnerships with those who can support us and not really weigh us down. And that's from a service level perspective, from a CPMS or a CMS perspective to supplier. Then, what that allows us to do is not only maintain a fairly open network of solutions that could be used with equipment, but also kind of makes it mutually beneficial for all to keep us all afloat. So there's a little bit of that. I think also it's just, you know, running the company in a very conservative manner that shows not just strength and, conservatism, but, still full on capability. And what I mean by that is we're very open on our partnerships with various companies that we work with. And, we make it clear to our customers that, we're going to be as efficient as possible and rely on people to, you know, do some of our work, because that's going to be more efficient for you and us, and not, just our bottom line. So, that's another aspect that I know we do quite well in terms of the transparency side of things. And, that's another core thing for our company and our, go to market strategy. And that's very key, is the aspect of transparency, and, really being upfront with customers on what is capable, and more importantly, what is not capable, and really committing to things that we can do and not committing to things that we can't do. I think that's where a lot of the recent failures you've seen have stemmed from, is overcommitments and underdeliverance.
That's right. Atish, this has been a great conversation. You sharing your time with us, sharing the story of XCharge, your journey, and led you up to where you're at, and what, rather, what differentiations and unique values that XCharge has in its product. As we get ready to wrap up here, just kind of, future outlook. Where do you think about XCharge in the next 5 years? What are some miles XCharge wants to get through?
Yeah, I mean, we're very optimistic about what the next 5 years is showing from an electric vehicle adoption standpoint. And, by way of that, we're very optimistic of what's to come for the infrastructure that's hopefully going to be needed to support that, especially in North America. What excites us is that there's a lot of empty space here. And from what we're seeing, there's a lot more interest in infrastructure for electric vehicles, which, frankly speaking, is going to mean hopefully better, more business for us. What we're scared about is, and not really scared, but we're keeping an eye on, I think, is the key thing, is how people go about deployment of infrastructure. Number one, the focuses we see. And then two, I guess how the settlement of various initiatives that are being rolled out or are now not being rolled out, affect, probably the next year or two of the space. And what I mean by that is like, we've had a lot of pullbacks in subsidies, there's a lot of things that were in limbo. Curious to see how things roll out there. I think the other thing that we're curious to see is, there's a hard shift from an EV standpoint in terms of the focus of the vehicles. Prior to, I'd say, this year, a lot of the focus has been on fluff, and kind of, gimmicky stuff, fastest 0 to 60, self parking, crab walking, big things, stuff like that. Now we're starting to see a return to utility. I mean, Chevy Bolt's coming out, the Tesla Model 3 standard, and the Model Y standards come out. You got Ford and all these other companies kind of returning to economical, more practical EV designs. And I think that's a very interesting shift. And we're curious to see how things roll out. I think, the only other thing is economy. Obviously, we're in an interesting time, seeing how that kind of affects the infrastructure and I guess liquidity space is going to be key. So, we're going to want to see how things play out there. For us, we're optimistic about growth. Like I said, I think we're still going to maintain our conservative viewpoint in terms of how we proceed. So, our focus is going to be pushing out the product lines we have. GridLink gel launched last year, C7 also, C6 is here. Really working to continue to cement those products in the marketplace through continued deployment, continued support, and continue optimization of the process we've kind of built up to support those products. And I think, from the other scale is like finding ways to help facilitate further deployment. And, one of the things that we've done that we kind of released over the past month is the initiative for leasing, which, from our standpoint, the way that we're looking at it, not only from an infrastructure standpoint, but also from like a capital funding standpoint, is going to be key, especially in markets like North America, where you have a large private presence of potential operators. So really kind of finding ways to help bridge the gaps to get more people to host this type of product and this type of asset, because we honestly think it's a really good investment. And now that we have some traction and some decent data to turn to from utilization, we're able to start building out resources to get more people kind of in on this. Not just operators, but also just small town mom and pops or independents who, speaking, were like me when I kind of got into this in the first place. Again, said a lot. I'll leave it to that, but it's a rosy outlook. We're still going to, watch our necks. Cause it's still, nothing is guaranteed just yet.
Yeah. Rosy outlook, but also rational. There's some rationality tucked in there.
There you go.
That's good. Well, Atish, thank you so much for being on Field Frequency. For those that want to connect with you directly, follow base, connect with XCharge, how could the audience reach out?
Yeah, I mean, we have our website, xcharge.us. There's obviously our product page and our contact form there. Honestly, our best ways to reach out and stay connected is our LinkedIn. I think we have our X or Twitter account, and then, it is a connection. We have a lot of people in the States. We're always open to connect on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect or follow with us just to keep in touch with what's going on.
Thank you for being on Field Frequency. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Take care.